Maria Santos wiped the sweat from her forehead as she finished mopping the last hallway at the downtown office building. It was nearly midnight and her back ached from hours of cleaning, but she couldn't help smiling. Today had been different from all the other late-night shifts. Today she had finally saved enough money. 3 months of extra work, picking up weekend shifts and skipping her usual coffee runs had led to this moment. In her worn purse was an envelope containing $250 in cash, enough to pay for her baby daughter's baptism at St. Catherine's Church. Sophia was sleeping peacefully in her carrier beside Maria's cleaning cart. At 6 months old, the little girl had already spent countless hours in office buildings, grocery stores, and churches while her mother worked. Maria often felt guilty about this, but what choice did she have? Daycare cost more than she made in a week, and her family could only help so much. The idea for the baptism had started when Maria was cleaning the offices at St. Catherine's Parish. She worked there twice a week, emptying trash cans and scrubbing floors in the administrative building next to the beautiful stone church. The building was always quiet during her evening shifts, but she could see the church through the windows. Its tall spires and colorful stained glass windows made her think of her grandmother. Abuela Rosa had been the most religious person Maria ever knew. She had raised Maria after her parents died in a car accident when she was 12. Every Sunday, without fail, Abuela Rosa took Maria to their small neighborhood church. She always said that baptism was the most important day in a person's life, even more important than birthdays or graduation. It's when God welcomes you into his family, Abuela Rosa would say, adjusting Maria's dress before they walked into church. No matter what happens in life, you always belong somewhere. When Maria found out she was pregnant, her boyfriend disappeared faster than morning dew. Her friends told her she was crazy to keep the baby. Money was already tight and raising a child alone seemed impossible. But something inside Maria refused to give up. Maybe it was Abuela Rosa's voice in her head, or maybe it was pure stubbornness. Now, holding Sophia every day, Maria knew she had made the right choice. The baby had her grandmother's dark eyes and the same peaceful expression Abuela Rosa wore during prayer. Maria wanted Sophia to have what she had growing up, that sense of belonging, of being welcomed into something bigger than themselves. The problem was that their neighborhood church had closed down 2 years ago. The building was old and needed too many repairs. The congregation was small and couldn't raise the money. Maria had been attending services at various churches since then, but none felt like home. That changed when she started working at St. Catherine's. The first time she saw inside the main church, she gasped. It was nothing like the simple wooden chapel where she grew up. St. Catherine's had marble floors, golden fixtures, and windows that painted rainbows on the walls when sunlight hit them. The altar was carved from white stone, and fresh flowers decorated every corner. But it wasn't just the beauty that drew her in. During her cleaning shifts, Maria often heard the church secretary, Mrs. Henderson, talking about upcoming events. The way she described baptisms made them sound magical. Professional photographers, reception halls, catered meals. Everything was perfect and elegant. Maria started attending Sunday services at St. Catherine's, sitting in the back row with Sophia. The congregation was different from what she was used to. Most people wore expensive clothes and drove cars that cost more than Maria made in a year. But the message was the same as in her childhood church. God loves everyone equally. After several weeks of attending services, Maria gathered the courage to approach Mrs. Henderson about scheduling Sophia's baptism. The older woman was surprisingly warm and helpful when Maria explained what she wanted. "Of course, dear," Mrs. Henderson had said, flipping through her appointment book. "We love celebrating new additions to our church family. Let me see what dates we have available." Mrs. Henderson showed Maria photos from recent baptisms. Happy families posed in front of the altar. Babies dressed in flowing white gowns, everyone smiling and celebrating. Maria imagined Sophia in one of those photos and felt her heart swell with joy. "The fee covers the ceremony, use of the reception hall, and a certificate," Mrs. Henderson explained. "It's $250 total." Maria's heart sank. That was more than she made in 2 weeks, but Mrs. Henderson didn't seem to notice her expression. "Take your time deciding on a date," the secretary continued. "Most families book several months in advance to make sure they get everything arranged perfectly." That night, Maria sat at her small kitchen table with a calculator and a stack of bills. If she worked extra shifts, skipped buying new clothes for herself, and lived on rice and beans for a few months, she could save the money. It would be tight but possible. The next morning, she called Mrs. Henderson back. "I'd like to schedule the baptism for 3 months from now," Maria said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Over the following weeks, Maria threw herself into preparation. She picked up extra cleaning jobs, worked late into the night, and accepted every overtime opportunity that came her way. Sophia seemed to sense something special was happening. She smiled more often and slept better, as if she understood that Mama was working toward something important. Maria's sister Carmen offered to help with the preparations. She had a friend who was a photographer and could take pictures for half the usual price. Her brother Carlos, despite struggling to find steady work himself, insisted on being Sophia's godfather. "Family takes care of family," he said when Maria worried about asking too much of him. Abuela Rosa would have expected nothing less. The hardest part was finding the right outfit for Sophia. Maria spent weeks looking through thrift stores and discount shops, searching for a white dress that would look appropriate for St. Catherine's elegant setting. Nothing seemed right until she remembered something. In her bedroom closet, wrapped carefully in tissue paper, was Abuela Rosa's baptism dress. Made of delicate white lace with tiny pearl buttons, it was nearly 60 years old, but still beautiful. Maria held it up to the light, checking for tears or stains. It was perfect. As the baptism day approached, Maria felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. She had done everything she could to make this special for Sophia. The money was saved, the arrangements were made, and the dress was ready. But something in the back of her mind worried that she might not fit in with St. Catherine's usual families. The night before the baptism, Maria sat in her small apartment holding Sophia and looking at Abuela Rosa's picture on the wall. "Tomorrow, your great-granddaughter officially becomes part of God's family," she whispered to the photo. "I hope I'm doing this right." Sophia cooed softly and grabbed Maria's finger, her tiny hand surprisingly strong. In that moment, Maria felt certain that everything would work out perfectly. After all, churches were supposed to welcome everyone with open arms. Maria woke up before her alarm clock rang. The morning light was just starting to peek through her small apartment windows, and Sophia was still sleeping peacefully in her crib. Today was the day they had been preparing for during the past 3 months. She had laid out their clothes the night before. Sophia's baptism dress, Abuela Rosa's precious white lace gown, hung carefully on a tiny hanger. Maria's own outfit was simple but clean, a navy blue dress she had bought at a thrift store and black shoes that she had polished until they shined. They weren't fancy, but they were the best she had. After feeding Sophia and getting them both dressed, Maria looked at herself in the bathroom mirror. She had spent extra time styling her hair and even put on a little makeup. Sophia looked like an angel in the vintage lace dress, which fit her perfectly despite being 6 decades old. "We look good, mija," Maria whispered to her daughter, who responded with a happy gurgle. The drive to St. Catherine's took only 15 minutes, but Maria left an hour early. She wanted to make sure everything was perfect and that she had time to calm her nerves before the ceremony began. Sophia fell asleep in her car seat, lulled by the gentle motion of Carmen's borrowed car. St. Catherine's looked even more impressive in the morning light. The stone walls seemed to glow and the tall bell tower reached toward the bright blue sky. Maria had seen the building hundreds of times during her cleaning shifts, but today it felt different. Today she wasn't coming as an employee. She was coming as a member of the community. She parked carefully and gathered Sophia's diaper bag, her purse, and the baby carrier. Sophia was still sleeping, her tiny face peaceful under the delicate lace of her great-grandmother's dress. Maria took a deep breath and walked toward the church entrance. The first person she saw was Mrs. Henderson, who was arranging flowers near the altar. The older woman looked up and smiled, but something in her expression seemed different from their previous meetings. Her eyes quickly took in Maria's appearance, from her simple dress to her worn shoes, then shifted to the sleeping baby. "Good morning, Mrs. Henderson," Maria said softly, not wanting to wake Sophia. "We're a little early, but I wanted to make sure everything was ready." "Yes, well," Mrs. Henderson replied, her voice lacking the warmth it had during their phone conversations. "The other families haven't arrived yet. Other families." Maria hadn't realized there would be multiple baptisms today. Mrs. Henderson had mentioned it was common for several ceremonies to happen during the same service. But somehow Maria had imagined Sophia would be the center of attention. As if reading her thoughts, Mrs. Henderson continued, "We have 3 baptisms scheduled today, The Ashworth family, the Weatherbys, and yours. She paused, then added, perhaps you'd be more comfortable waiting in the side chapel until the service begins. Maria felt a small knot form in her stomach, but she nodded politely. The side chapel was smaller and quieter, which would probably be better for Sophia anyway. She made her way to the indicated area and settled into a wooden pew. From her seat, she could see the main church filling up with people arriving for the morning service. The first family to enter took Maria's breath away. The woman wore a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than Maria made in 3 months. Her jewelry sparkled under the church lights and her hair was perfectly styled. The man beside her wore an expensive-looking suit and carried himself with the confidence that comes from never worrying about money. Their baby was dressed in an elaborate christening gown with layers of silk and lace. Even the baby's blanket looked like it came from an expensive boutique. A professional photographer followed them, snapping pictures of every moment. Maria looked down at Sophia, still sleeping peacefully in Abuela Rosa's vintage dress. The lace was beautiful and had been lovingly preserved, but next to the other family's elaborate outfit, it suddenly seemed old and simple. The second family that entered was equally impressive. The mother wore a designer dress and high heels that clicked elegantly on the marble floor. The father checked his expensive watch and spoke quietly into a phone. Their baby was surrounded by what seemed like a dozen relatives, all dressed in clothes that probably cost more than Maria's monthly rent. More families began arriving for the regular Sunday service. Maria noticed how they all seemed to know each other, greeting one another with warm hugs and comfortable familiarity. Their conversations were filled with references to vacation homes, private schools, and charity galas. Sophia began to stir in her arms, making small sounds that meant she would be waking up soon. Maria gently rocked her, hoping to keep her calm until the service started. "Excuse me," a voice said behind her. Maria turned to see a woman in her 50s wearing a pearls necklace and a disapproving expression. "Are you here for the baptism service?" "Yes," Maria replied quietly. "My daughter Sophia is being baptized today." The woman's eyes traveled from Maria's simple dress to the baby's vintage gown, then back to Maria's face. "Oh," she said, and something in her tone made Maria's stomach tighten. "I see." Without another word, the woman walked away, but Maria noticed her whispering to another well-dressed woman near the altar. Both of them glanced in Maria's direction, their expressions making it clear they were discussing her. Mrs. Henderson appeared again, this time looking flustered. "I'm sorry," she said, though her tone suggested she wasn't sorry at all. "There seems to have been some confusion about the scheduling today." Maria felt her heart skip a beat. "Confusion? What kind of confusion?" "Well," Mrs. Henderson said, glancing around nervously, "I'm not sure we have all the necessary paperwork completed for your daughter's baptism, but I filled out all the forms weeks ago," Maria said, trying to keep her voice calm. "You said everything was ready." "Yes, well, sometimes these things get mixed up," Mrs. Henderson replied, her eyes avoiding Maria's face. "Perhaps we should reschedule for a different date when we can give your daughter the proper attention she deserves." Sophia had woken up and was looking around with wide, curious eyes. She seemed fascinated by the colored light streaming through the stained glass windows. Maria held her closer, feeling protective and confused. "Mrs. Henderson," Maria said carefully, "I've been planning this for months. My family is coming and I've already paid the fee. Is there really a problem with the paperwork?" Before Mrs. Henderson could answer, Father McKenna approached. The elderly priest had always been kind during the services Maria attended, and she felt a surge of hope when she saw him. "Good morning," he said warmly to Maria. "This must be little Sophia. What a beautiful dress." "Thank you, Father," Maria replied, feeling some of her tension ease. "It was my grandmother's baptism dress." Father McKenna smiled and was about to say more when Mrs. Henderson quickly pulled him aside. They spoke in whispers, but Maria could see the priest's expression change as Mrs. Henderson explained something to him. His kind smile faded and he looked uncertain. Around them, the church continued to fill with well-dressed families. Maria noticed more people glancing in her direction, and the whispers seemed to be growing louder. A security guard had appeared near the main entrance, which seemed unusual for a Sunday morning service. Carlos arrived with Carmen and her 2 young children, all dressed in their Sunday best. They looked around the impressive church with awe, then spotted Maria in the side chapel. "This place is incredible," Carlos whispered as he sat down beside his sister. "Sophia's going to remember this day forever." Maria tried to smile, but the growing knot in her stomach made it difficult. Something was wrong, and she could feel it in the way people were looking at her, in Mrs. Henderson's changed attitude, and in the uncertainty she had seen in Father McKenna's eyes. Sophia gurgled happily, reaching for the colorful light patterns on the wall. She had no idea that her special day was already starting to go wrong. The morning service was about to begin, and the main church was nearly full. Maria could hear the organ playing softly as families settled into their pews. She watched as the other two families scheduled for baptism took their places in the front rows, surrounded by relatives and friends carrying expensive cameras and flower arrangements. Mrs. Henderson returned to the side chapel, but this time she wasn't alone. She was accompanied by two well-dressed women who looked like they belonged to the church's board of directors. Their designer handbags and perfect makeup made Maria feel even more out of place in her simple thrift store dress. "I'm afraid we need to discuss something," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice now completely lacking any pretense of warmth. "There seems to be a significant issue with your registration." Maria's heart began to pound. "What kind of issue?" "I have all my paperwork right here." She reached into her purse and pulled out the folder containing Sophia's birth certificate, her own identification, and the receipt showing she had paid the baptism fee in full. One of the women with Mrs. Henderson looked at the documents briefly, then handed them back with a dismissive gesture. "The issue isn't with the paperwork," she said coldly. "The issue is that we weren't fully aware of your circumstances when the appointment was made." "My circumstances," Maria repeated, confusion mixing with a growing sense of dread. "Well," Mrs. Henderson said, glancing around to make sure other people could hear, "we've since learned that you're employed as a cleaning person in our administrative building. This changes things considerably." Carlos, who had been listening quietly, stood up from the pew. "What does her job have to do with her daughter's baptism?" Mrs. Henderson's expression hardened. "Sir, please keep your voice down. We're in a house of worship." She turned back to Maria. "The fact is, our congregation has certain standards. We cater to established families in the community, people who can contribute meaningfully to our church's mission and reputation." Maria felt like she had been slapped. "I've been attending services here for months. I pay my tithe every week, even when money is tight." "Yes, but $5 or $10 a week hardly compares to what our established families contribute," one of the other women said. "The Ashworth family donated $50,000 for our new piano. The Weatherbys funded our youth ministry program entirely." Carmen, who had been holding her own children, stepped closer to Maria. "Are you saying she can't have her baby baptized here because she's not rich enough?" "We're saying," Mrs. Henderson replied, her voice rising slightly, "that she might be more comfortable at St. Anthony's across town. They serve people from her background. Working-class families, you know. They'd appreciate her there." The words hit Maria like physical blows. People from her background. Working-class families. The way Mrs. Henderson said it made it sound like being poor was a disease that might be contagious. Sophia, who had been contentedly looking around at the pretty windows, began to fuss. She could sense the tension in her mother's body and the hostile voices around them. "I'm not going anywhere," Maria said, her voice shaking but determined. "I paid for this ceremony just like everyone else. My daughter has every right to be baptized here." Father McKenna appeared again, looking deeply uncomfortable. Several parishioners had begun to gather around, drawn by the raised voices. Maria recognized some of them from Sunday services, but their faces showed no warmth or recognition now. "Perhaps we could discuss this more privately," Father McKenna suggested weakly, but Mrs. Henderson cut him off. "Father, with all due respect, we need to think about what's best for the church community. Our families have invested heavily in maintaining St. Catherine's reputation and excellence. We can't just open our doors to anyone." "Anyone?" Carlos stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "My sister is a good, honest, hard-working woman. And she's more Christian than any of you people." "Young man," one of the board women said sharply, "there's no need for hostility. We're simply suggesting that your sister would be happier somewhere more suitable." Maria looked around at the faces surrounding her. Some showed open disgust. Others looked uncomfortable but said nothing. A few people had their phones out and she realized with horror that they might be recording this humiliation. "What's happening here?" a new voice asked. Maria turned to see an older man in an expensive suit approaching their group. He had silver hair and carried himself with authority, but his expression showed genuine concern rather than judgment. "Nothing that concerns you, Robert," Mrs. Henderson said quickly. "Just a small scheduling mix-up." But the man, Robert, looked from Mrs. Henderson to Maria, taking in the situation. His eyes lingered on Sophia, who was now crying softly in Maria's arms. "It looks like more than a scheduling issue," he said calmly. "What exactly is the problem?" Before anyone could answer, Mrs. Henderson made her final move. She gestured toward the back of the church and Maria saw the security guard she had noticed earlier walking toward them. "I'm sorry," Mrs. Henderson announced loudly enough for half the congregation to hear, "but I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This is a private ceremony and you're disrupting the service." Gasps echoed through the nearby pews. Some people looked shocked, but Maria noticed that several of the well-dressed families were nodding in approval. The Ashworth woman whispered something to her husband, who looked at Maria with obvious distaste. "You can't throw us out," Carmen said, her voice trembling with emotion. "This is supposed to be a house of God. This is a private institution," Mrs. Henderson replied coldly, "and we have the right to refuse service to anyone who doesn't meet our standards." The security guard, a middle-aged man who looked deeply uncomfortable with the situation, approached Maria hesitantly. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I'm going to have to ask you to gather your things." Maria looked down at Sophia, who was crying harder now. The baby's face was red with distress and her tiny fists waved in the air. Maria's own eyes filled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. "Not here. Not in front of these people. This is wrong," she whispered, but her voice carried in the sudden quiet of the church. "Life isn't always fair, dear," Mrs. Henderson said with fake sympathy. "You'll understand when you're older. Some places just aren't meant for everyone." Carlos moved toward Mrs. Henderson, his fists clenched, but Maria grabbed his arm. "No," she said firmly. "Don't give them any more reasons." The whispers around them grew louder. Maria could hear fragments of conversations. "Should have known better." What was she thinking? "Doesn't belong here." Robert, the man in the expensive suit, had been watching everything in silence. His face had grown darker with each word from Mrs. Henderson, and Maria noticed his hands clenching at his sides. Father McKenna stood frozen, clearly torn between doing what was right and avoiding conflict with his most powerful parishioners. Several families had their children pressed close to them, as if Maria's presence might somehow contaminate their perfect morning. The security guard took another step toward Maria. "Ma'am, I really don't want to make this more difficult than it needs to be." Maria looked around one final time at the beautiful church where she had dreamed of celebrating Sophia's baptism. The stained glass windows still painted colorful patterns on the walls. The altar still gleamed with its white marble and golden fixtures. But the magic was gone, replaced by something ugly and cold. Sophia's crying had attracted the attention of the entire congregation now. People were turning in their seats to stare at the commotion. Maria felt exposed and humiliated, but something inside her refused to back down. "Come on, Sophia," she whispered to her daughter. "Maybe Abuela Rosa was wrong. Maybe not everyone belongs in God's family." That's when Robert finally spoke. "Stop right there." Robert's voice cut through the tension like a sharp blade. It wasn't loud, but something in his tone made everyone freeze. The security guard stopped mid-step. Mrs. Henderson's mouth snapped shut. Even Sophia's crying seemed to quiet down. Robert walked slowly toward Maria, his expensive leather shoes clicking on the marble floor. Every eye in the church followed him. Maria had never seen him before, but it was clear that everyone else knew exactly who he was. "You said your name is Maria?" he asked gently, completely ignoring the hostile faces around them. "Yes, sir," Maria replied quietly, bouncing Sophia gently to keep her calm. "And this beautiful little girl is Sophia?" Maria nodded, surprised by the kindness in his voice. It was the first warmth she had felt from anyone in this church today besides her own family. Robert smiled at the baby, who had stopped crying and was now staring at him with wide, curious eyes. "She's wearing a very special dress, isn't she?" "It was my grandmother's," Maria said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your grandmother had excellent taste," Robert said. then straightened up and faced Mrs. Henderson. The gentle expression disappeared from his face. Now, would someone like to explain to me why this young mother and her baby are being asked to leave their own baptism ceremony? Mrs. Henderson's confidence seemed to evaporate under Robert's steady gaze. Well, Mr. Castellano, there was some confusion about the scheduling, and we thought perhaps— I heard what you thought, Robert interrupted, his voice still calm but with an edge that made several people step back. I heard every word of it. What I want to know is how you justify treating a member of our church community this way. She's not really a member of our community, one of the board women said, though she sounded much less confident than she had moments before. She just works here as a cleaning person. Robert turned to look at the woman, and she actually took a step backward. Mrs. Whitman, isn't it? Your husband owns the accounting firm downtown? Yes, he does, Mrs. Whitman replied, confusion in her voice. And you consider yourself a good Christian woman? Of course I do. I've been coming to this church for 20 years. Then please explain to me, Robert said, his voice getting quieter, which somehow made it more threatening, how you can stand in God's house and tell a young mother that her baby isn't good enough to be baptized here because she works for a living. Mrs. Whitman opened and closed her mouth like a fish, unable to find words. Robert continued, addressing the growing crowd around them. I've been a member of St. Catherine's for 30 years. I've served on the board, donated to every major renovation, and supported every charity drive. In all that time, I thought I understood what this church stood for. He paused and looked around at the faces staring at him. Many people looked uncomfortable now, realizing that their silence made them part of what was happening. But apparently, Robert continued, I was wrong. Apparently, we've forgotten that Christ himself said, "Suffer the little children to come unto me." Apparently, we've decided that God's love comes with a price tag. Mrs. Henderson tried to regain control of the situation. Mr. Castellano, you don't understand. We have standards to maintain. Our reputation. Robert's voice rose for the first time, and several people jumped. Our reputation is that we turn away babies from baptism because their mothers work honest jobs. That's the reputation you want to build? Father McKenna finally found his voice. Robert, please, let's discuss this calmly. No, Father, Robert said firmly. This has gone far beyond discussion. This young woman paid her fee, followed all the proper procedures, and came here in good faith to have her daughter welcomed into the church family. Instead, she's been humiliated and treated like she's not worthy to breathe the same air as the rest of us. He walked closer to Mrs. Henderson, and Maria noticed that despite his age, Robert was tall and imposing. Do you know what Maria does when she cleans our offices, Mrs. Henderson? Mrs. Henderson shook her head nervously. She works until midnight, sometimes later, to make sure everything is perfect. She takes pride in her work. She's never missed a day, never complained, never asked for special treatment. She comes to church every Sunday and sits quietly in the back, never bothering anyone. Robert's voice carried throughout the church now, reaching every corner. She saved for months to pay for this baptism. Do you know how much sacrifice that represents for someone in her position? $250 might be pocket change to some of us, but for Maria, it probably meant skipping meals and working extra shifts. Maria felt tears running down her cheeks, but for the first time all morning, they weren't tears of humiliation. Someone understood. Someone saw her as more than just a poor cleaning lady. And you, Robert continued, turning to address the other families who had been watching with approval. You were all prepared to let this happen. You were going to stand by and watch a mother and her baby get thrown out of church on what should be one of the most important days of their lives. A few people in the crowd looked ashamed now. Some turned away, unable to meet Robert's gaze. The Ashworth man who had been whispering disapprovingly earlier stepped forward. Now see here, Castellano. We can't just let anyone what? Robert interrupted. Anyone who works for a living? Anyone who isn't wealthy enough to buy their way into God's grace? He gestured toward Maria and Sophia. Look at them. Really look at them. That baby is dressed in a famille. The heirloom that's probably been passed down through generations. Her mother has prepared for months for this day. They came here with love and hope and faith. Robert's voice grew stronger. That's what church is supposed to be about. Not about how much money you can donate or what kind of car you drive to Sunday service. It's about faith and love and welcoming everyone into God's family. Mrs. Henderson made one last desperate attempt to maintain her position. Mr. Castellano, I understand you're upset. But we have procedures. The only procedure we should be following, Robert said firmly, is the one where we apologize to this young woman and proceed with her daughter's baptism immediately. The security guard, who had been standing awkwardly through this entire exchange, quietly stepped back and disappeared into the crowd. Even he could see which way this was going. Sophia, who had been remarkably calm throughout the confrontation, chose that moment to reach out toward Robert with a tiny smile. Without hesitation, he gently took her small hand in his. "Hello there, sweetheart," he said softly, his voice full of warmth. "Are you ready to be officially welcomed into our church family?" The gesture was simple, but its effect was powerful. Here was one of the most respected men in the congregation, clearly delighted to interact with the baby that others had been treating as unwelcome. Father McKenna, finally freed from the pressure of the influential families who had been driving the discrimination, stepped forward with renewed confidence. "You're absolutely right, Robert. We're here to celebrate Sophia's baptism, and that's exactly what we're going to do." Mrs. Henderson looked around desperately for support, but found none. The families who had been backing her up moments before were now silent, unwilling to go against Robert's clear moral authority. "I think," Robert said, looking directly at Mrs. Henderson, "that you owe Maria and her family an apology." The church fell completely silent except for the soft sound of Sophia's happy babbling. As she played with Robert's finger, Mrs. Henderson's face had gone pale. She looked around the church, searching for any support, but found only uncomfortable silence and disapproving stares. The families who had been nodding along with her discrimination just minutes before were now studying their shoes or pretending to be fascinated by the stained glass windows. Mrs. Henderson started, then stopped. She looked at Maria, who was still holding Sophia close, tears drying on her cheeks. "I suppose there may have been some misunderstanding about the situation." "That's not an apology," Robert said firmly. "This young woman deserves better than excuses." Mrs. Henderson's shoulders sagged. "You're right. Maria, I'm sorry. I was wrong to treat you that way. Your daughter has every right to be baptized here." The words sounded forced, but Maria could hear genuine regret underneath them. She nodded quietly, not trusting her voice to remain steady. Carlos stepped closer to his sister, his protective instincts still on high alert. Carmen moved to Maria's other side, creating a family circle around Sophia, who was now smiling and reaching for the colorful light patterns dancing on the church walls. "Mrs. Whitman?" Robert turned to the board member who had been so vocal about Maria's working-class background. "Do you have something to add?" Mrs. Whitman looked like she wanted to disappear through the marble floor. Yes, I apologize as well. I spoke without thinking, and that was inexcusable." One by one, the other people who had supported the discrimination mumbled their apologies. None of them sounded particularly sincere, but Maria could see that they were genuinely embarrassed by how the situation had played out. Father McKenna clapped his hands together, his face brightening with relief. "Well then, I believe we have a baptism to celebrate. Maria, would you and your family please join me at the altar?" The walk down the center aisle felt completely different now. Robert walked beside Maria, gently encouraging Sophia to laugh by making silly faces at her. Carlos and Carmen followed closely, their heads held high with pride. The congregation watched, but the whispers were different now. Maria caught fragments of conversations. "Such a beautiful baby. That dress is gorgeous, and can't believe how we almost..." The Ashworth family, who had been so disapproving earlier, moved to make room in the front pew. Mrs. Ashworth even smiled at Maria as she passed, though it looked strained. At the altar, Father McKenna had transformed back into the warm, welcoming priest Maria remembered from Sunday services. "Before we begin," he announced to the congregation, "I want to say something about what just happened here today." The church fell silent. "We almost made a terrible mistake," Father McKenna continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the building. "We almost forgot what it means to be a Christian community. We almost turned away a child of God because we got caught up in worldly concerns about status and appearances." He looked directly at Maria and Sophia. "This little girl doesn't care about her mother's job or her family's bank account. She comes to us pure and innocent, ready to be welcomed into God's family. That's what baptism is about. That's what faith is about." The ceremony that followed was more beautiful than Maria had ever imagined. Father McKenna held Sophia with gentle confidence, speaking the ancient words of baptism with warmth and meaning. When he poured the blessed water over Sophia's head, the baby didn't cry. Instead, she looked around with wide eyes as if she understood something important was happening. Robert had quietly arranged for the church photographer to capture every moment. The professional, who had originally been hired only for the Ashworth and Weatherby families, took dozens of pictures of Sophia's baptism, treating it with the same importance as the other ceremonies. As Father McKenna handed Sophia back to Maria, something unexpected happened. The congregation began to applaud. It started slowly with just a few people clapping, but quickly spread throughout the church. Soon, everyone was standing and applauding not just Sophia's baptism, but what it represented, the community coming together to do what was right. After the service ended, Robert approached Maria as she was gathering her things. "I hope you don't mind," he said, "but I took the liberty of reserving the church reception hall for Sophia's celebration. I know you might not have planned anything, but every baptism deserves a proper party." Maria's eyes widened. "Mr. Castellano, I can't let you do that. I don't have money for a reception." "Consider it my gift to Sophia," Robert smiled. "Besides, I have a feeling this is going to be a celebration the whole church will want to be part of." He was right. As they moved to the reception hall, Maria was amazed to see how many people followed them. Families who had ignored her for months were now introducing themselves and asking about Sophia. The Weatherby family brought a beautiful flower arrangement from their own celebration to share. Even Mrs. Henderson appeared with a small wrapped gift. "It's just a little something," she said awkwardly, handing Maria a package. "A silver baby spoon. It's engraved with today's date." The reception was unlike anything Maria had ever experienced. There was professional catering, a beautiful cake with Sophia's name written in delicate script, and more flowers than she had ever seen in one place. But the best part was the warmth. People who had been strangers that morning were now cooing over Sophia, sharing parenting advice, and treating Maria like she had always been part of their community. Carlos found Maria near the cake table, both of them watching Sophia sleep peacefully in Carmen's arms. "Can you believe this?" he whispered. "A few hours ago they were throwing us out." "Sometimes," Maria replied. "It just takes one person to stand up for what's right to change everything." As the reception was winding down, Robert approached Maria one more time. "I wonder if you might have a few minutes to talk privately." They found a quiet corner of the hall where Sophia could sleep undisturbed in her carrier. "I've been thinking," Robert said, "about what happened today and about you. I run a property management company, and I'm looking for someone to manage our residential buildings. It would mean better hours, better pay, and health insurance for you and Sophia." Maria stared at him, hardly able to believe what she was hearing. "Mr. Castellano, I don't have experience managing properties, but you have experience taking care of things, being responsible, and treating people with respect," he replied. "Those are the qualities I need most. The rest can be learned." 6 months later, Maria was sitting in her new office reviewing maintenance requests for 3 apartment buildings. Sophia, now a year old, played happily in a corner of the office that Robert had converted into a small nursery area. The job had changed everything. Maria could afford a small apartment with 2 bedrooms. Sophia had health insurance, and for the first time in years, Maria wasn't worried about making ends meet. But perhaps more importantly, her experience at St. Catherine's had created lasting change. Father McKenna had worked with the church board to establish new policies ensuring that all families were welcomed equally, regardless of their financial situation. They started a scholarship fund to help cover baptism and wedding costs for families who couldn't afford them. Mrs. Henderson had resigned as church secretary, and the new secretary was a young woman who had grown up in a working-class family herself. The church began hosting community dinners and job training programs, reaching out to serve everyone in the neighborhood. On Sophia's first birthday, Maria returned to St. Catherine's for Sunday service. As they sat in what had once been their back pew, Maria noticed something that made her smile. The church was more diverse now, filled with families from all walks of life. Children in hand-me-down clothes played alongside children in designer outfits. After service, Robert joined them in the pew. "How's our Sophia doing?" he asked, making faces at the toddler until she giggled. "She's perfect," Maria replied, watching her daughter clap her hands with delight. "And I think Abuela Rosa was right after all." Everyone does belong in God's family. Sometimes we just have to remind each other of that. As they left the church together, Maria felt a deep sense of peace. Sophia would grow up knowing that she belonged everywhere, that her worth wasn't measured by her family's bank account, and that sometimes when things seem darkest, unexpected allies appear to light the way forward. The baptism that had started as Maria's worst nightmare had become the beginning of the best chapter of their life.